Welcome to the Soul Grit podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hi, welcome back to the Soul Grit podcast. This is Ann. I'm here today with Bart Blair. Hi, Bart.
Hi, Ann. How are you today?
Good. I'm glad to have you here. Now, Bart is a pastor, but he's also a dad, and he's in digital marketing and does a lot of work with church plants. And yet today we're having him here because he's an author of a book that talks about grief during the holiday season. And so we know the holidays are coming up, and for some of us, it's going to be more challenging this year than it was in previous years because of loss. And so Bart, thank you. I just want to say I'm sorry that you had to be the one to write this book, but thank you also for writing this book. And I'd like
Yeah.
you to just share a little bit about who you are and tell us your story a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Actually, something I forgot to communicate to you as you were
Yeah.
introducing me is that I'm actually a grandparent now, but
Oh,
that's new. I've only been a grandparent for 2 weeks.
oh,
So I keep
congratulations.
forgetting to I keep forgetting to tell people that I'm not just a parent, but I'm actually a grandparent. We
Well,
have
congrats.
twin baby
Oh my,
boys named Asher and Noah, who were born just a couple of weeks ago at the time that we're recording this. So
oh,
yeah,
that's
very
amazing.
exciting
You're
time
gonna have to
for our
send me a
family.
picture of that.
I will be happy to do that. And because there's two of them, we have, double the number of photos that you would typically have. Yeah, my story a little bit. I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is where I grew up. I grew up in I would call a churched home, not necessarily a Christian home, but a churched family. And from a very early age, was taught a lot about God, and I learned a lot about the Bible. By the time I was in my high school, my college years, I was kind of off the rails, not following Jesus, certainly not living a life that was God honoring. But in my mid to late 20s, I had moved out to the East Coast of the U.S., was living in the Baltimore, D.C. area, connected with some guys there that were genuine followers of Jesus who were different than any other Christians that I'd ever really been around. These were guys that were just real dudes, and no matter what they were doing, and no matter where they went, they talked about Jesus, and they talked about him as if he was a real person that they knew, not some historical figure in a book.
Mhm.
And I realized that they had something that I didn't have, and it began a real significant spiritual pursuit for me. And I had made a profession of faith in Jesus as a kid. Whether or not I was really born again at that time, I don't really know, but I do remember, about in my 26th or 27th year of life, sitting in a car on the side of the road, having a conversation with God, saying, I really don't know where I've been in your books up to this point, but
Mhm.
I'm putting a stake in the ground today. Like, I'm
Yeah.
yours. Do with my life whatever you want to do with my life, and I'm yours. And it was, I didn't realize at the time how bold the prayer was. I found myself literally only a few years later in the Toronto area, helping some guys plant a church, eventually leaving a corporate job that I was in to join the staff of that church plant as the worship pastor and creative arts director. I served at that church for about 12 years. It was during that time that I met my wife, Elizabeth, and we started our family in Toronto. Eventually, I moved out to Southeast Alberta and co-planted a church in Southeast Alberta. I was on staff of that church for about 7.5, almost 8 years, and I was the senior pastor of that church for about 5.5. And ended up moving back to Texas about 6.5 years ago or so. My parents were aging. My father was having some health issues, and we needed to get back here. And at the time that I moved back, our daughter Sarah was married and was staying in Alberta. And we moved down to Texas with our two sons, my wife Elizabeth and I, with our two sons, Silas and Ephraim, who were in high school at the time. And it was a big transition for us as a family. Moving back to Texas was kind of cool because we were back near where I'd grown up. Some longtime friends here. My family was all here. And For the most part, we plugged into a church. I started some different ministry work with the denomination that I'm in and with a digital marketing company that works specifically with churches. And things were going very, very well. And then all of a sudden they weren't. To kind of summarize, where we sort of ended up in January of 2021, our youngest son, who was 16, who was a junior in high school, instead of going to school one day, took his own life.
Mm.
And we had no indication that there was anything wrong. Things had been going very well for him. He had a good job. He had saved a ton of money and had just bought his first car a couple of weeks before. The last dinner that we had with him, my wife and I were talking. He had just gotten his senior class schedule, and he had enough credits that he wasn't going to have to go to school full time, and he was pretty excited about that. And after dinner that evening, he went up to his room and we went and did our thing, went to bed that night. And the next morning, we all, as families do, all kind of went our different directions. And he got in his car, and we thought he went to school, but he didn't. And he never came home. And so that was January 26th of 2021. And I remember it because it was also our wedding anniversary. And so it just kind of hit real hard. Needless to say, it's something that you can't prepare yourself for. It catches you off guard. It flipped our entire family upside down. And what we thought was, we were tracking. Life was good.
Yeah.
Life was things that we just had so many good things going on. There'd been some hard years in church planting and some hard years in ministry and hard years in marriage, as there are in every marriage in everybody's life. But we had sort of reached this place where I remember my wife and I just, through the pandemic, we were enjoying sitting on the patio in our backyard, eating meals together when everybody was stuck at home. And we're like, man, we've got a good life here. Things are going well with our kids. Things are going well at home. Financially, the Lord is meeting our needs, and everything is good. And then in one day, everything was turned upside down. And so we've been living with that grief and that loss now for coming up on 4 years. It's hard for me to believe that it's been almost 4 years since Ephraim left us. But God has continued to prove himself faithful through this entire journey. And part of God's faithfulness is just the inspiration that he gave me to share some of our experience in this book that I've written, which is called
Mhm.
Grief Makes Christmas Complicated. And hence the reason you and I are having this conversation today.
Right. Right. Yeah. I thank you for sharing your background, like everything that was leading up to just a normal, successful life, right? A
Yeah.
normal evening dinner, a normal morning saying goodbye, go to work, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
everything changes.
Yeah.
And then these last 4 years, they've been pretty challenging, just for everybody, right?
Right.
This has been a
Yeah.
hard time. And then you add another layer. It probably feels at some point like, when do I get to breathe again? When do I get to feel normal again? Mm.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess, what the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic did, and in the way that it sort of impacted our culture and our world and all of us individually. If I'm to be perfectly honest with you, because of our own personal trauma and our own personal tragedy, I, in a lot of ways, sort of lost sight of what was going on in the rest of the world,
Yeah,
because
I bet.
your tendency is to really sort of become inward focused, and you begin focusing primarily on, well, in the initial days, how do I just get out of bed every day?
Yeah.
Do I bother taking a shower, not just today, but this week at all? Right?
Yeah.
What's the point in eating? It doesn't, so much of our culture is around eating, and we enjoy eating, and there's pleasure in eating. But now all of a sudden you find yourself, well, I just eating because I have to eat,
Yeah.
not because I really want to eat. And
Mhm.
so much of when you lose someone that's close to you, someone that you love, someone that's a part of your day in, day out life, um, it changes your perspective, your short-term vision and your long-term vision for life and love and everything else gets flipped upside down. And I shared with you, before you and I started recording, that I'm not a counselor. I've been a pastor for over 22, 23 years. And I have counseled to the degree that a pastor shepherd can and should, but I don't consider myself a counselor, and I don't give counsel to people other than what I've experienced. And
Mhm.
I'm a practitioner of grief and sorrow and loss,
Mhm.
and so that's really what I've kind of leaned into here as I've written this book,
Mhm.
and really just been trying to be an encouragement to other people who have or might be going through a similar experience.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I know you say I'm not a grief expert. I'm
Yeah,
just grief experienced.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and I think that even for me being a mental health expert, meaning like I'm licensed, I practice, I worked with hundreds of people, I don't consider myself an expert on grief either because it's not something that you can really become an expert on until you have experienced it. And
yeah.
so I consider you as much of an expert as the next person because
Sure.
you have this experience. But you have a unique perspective here because you have walked with so many families over these couple of decades of ministry. You've been walking with people who experience all kinds of different losses. And so, how would you say that that experience informed what you were writing in the book?
I will say, it's interesting when I transitioned out of pastoring the church that I was leading in Alberta back in 2018. One of the last responsibilities that I had as a pastor there was to actually preside over a memorial service for some people who were part of our church. And I remember sitting in the living room. It was a gentleman who, in his 50s, passed away suddenly and unexpectedly. And I was sitting in the living room with his wife, his widow, and his adult children, and just doing what I thought was the right thing to do, and just talk to them, ask questions, encourage them, love on them, and I I guess trying to be the expert in the room to help them deal with their grief. And I fast forward several years and found myself sitting on the opposite side of that with pastors in my house talking to me, trying to encourage me. One of the things that I realized, and I write about this a little bit in the book is pretty short, so I don't go into a lot of depth and detail on a lot of things. But one of the things that I realized um, when we went through our loss is that while everyone in the family loses the same person, everyone loses a different relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never really processed that as a pastor, as a comforter, as that brother in Christ who sits with a family or someone who's trying to encourage them and help them grieve and help them get through their season of loss together. You think, oh, this person died and everybody lost the same person, so everybody sort of grieves the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But we're all going to grieve differently simply because we're wired differently. Our personalities are different. We're going to handle the loss differently. But we've all lost something different, even though it's the same person. And I lost the son, the child that was the most like me when it came to personality and disposition and just outlook on life. My wife lost her baby. You only get one baby when you're a mom, and she had three kids, and she lost the youngest. Our oldest daughter, Sarah, lost the little brother whose diapers she, helped change, and really, she just became a mother, and a lot of her mothering experience comes from having helped with her baby brother when he was born. And then our middle son lost really one of his closest friends. And even though as siblings they weren't best buds, I see him now as a young adult. I see, even though he probably doesn't think about his brother and that loss on a daily basis the way that my wife and I would think about it, I see in the way that he chooses to live his life and the relationships that he has now, and just sort of, I see what he's missing. And, he may not realize it so much, but this was the brother that he played catch with, that he got into trouble with, that, he learned to skateboard with, that he used to go fishing with. And he doesn't have that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And, we know they're just as being close as brothers, as kids doesn't necessarily always equate to being close as brothers, as adults. But we all lost a different person. And so we've grieved differently in trying to get through the season. All of us are also in a different season in our faith journey, and that
Mhm.
also plays into it. Someone who's in their 50s, like I am, who's been walking with Jesus for close to 30 years, is definitely going to, from a faith perspective, deal with it very differently than someone in their 20s who
Mhm.
may have only been walking with Jesus for a few years, right? So that plays into it as well.
Yeah. It reminds me, I'm sure you read something about this because you mentioned C.S. Lewis in your book. There's
Mm,
this kind of a story about how the Inklings met together, right? This is J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S.
mhm.
Lewis and a couple other guys that are less well known to us Americans.
Yeah.
Um, and they would gather together and they would go over manuscripts and they would help each other in their writing. And then when one of them died, they realize you never get back that relationship with
Mhm.
the person. So, for example, in your situation, nobody in your family ever gets Ephraim's dad again.
Right.
Like they never get to see the part of you that he pulled out of you.
Right.
And so then all of the relationships change.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
That's very
another,
true.
it's just another layer of loss. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There is so much in it. And again, I think, you know, everybody, this shouldn't surprise us that death is just something that we're going to face in life. I think in our situation, losing a child, there's not much that you can compare
Mhm.
to that. But I certainly don't want to limit the support and the help and the encouragement that I give solely to people who've lost a child, because
Mhm.
I've known people who've lost a parent or lost a sibling or lost a spouse or lost a friend,
Yeah.
and the consequences of that loss reverberated in their life for years.
Mhm.
And part of it was because that relationship was unique and it was valuable and it was needed in their lives. And when you lose someone that's close to you whose life is intertwined with yours in some way, shape, or form, whether that's by marriage or just by close friendship, by mentorship, there's so many different people who make an impact in our lives. When you lose those people, you don't get that back, and that relationship that you have with that person is severed. It's frozen really in time in a
Mhm.
lot of ways, right?
Mhm.
Like our son would be 20 years old today. He died at 16. There are
Mhm.
no memories after 16. There's no more photos after
Yeah.
16. We just, because our daughter just had these twin baby boys, we just traveled up to Alberta for 2 weeks to spend time with our family there. And the boys that my son Ephraim had played baseball with and grown up with, they're all in their 20s and in college now.
Mhm.
And he's frozen in time as that
Right.
16-year-old.
Yeah.
And not a bad time in life to be frozen as a 16-year-old, but that's not what we hoped for. That's not what we longed for. That's not what we expected.
Mhm.
And as I see parents post pictures of their kids on Facebook or Instagram, a lot of his friends have just had their 20th birthdays, and
Mhm.
parents posting, wow, time flies. Can't believe he's already 20 in the pictures. And we don't get to do that. We don't get that kind of celebration. And so, on one level, you can be bitter or embittered by the
Mhm.
fact that you don't get that, or the other side is, I'm just extraordinarily grateful to have been Ephraim's dad for 16 years.
Mhm.
I can say that today. That wasn't the way I was feeling even a year ago. I
Yeah.
would say 2024, just the last 9, 10 months have been an accelerated bit of healing for me. And I think writing this book this year was part of that cathartic process of sort of documenting some of our story, some of our journey, giving me a reason and an opportunity to reflect on where we started in 2021 with our grief journey and where we are today.
Mhm.
Still a long way from where I pray and hope that we will someday be.
Yeah.
But it does, it does require you, I think, sometimes to sort of tap the brakes, stop, look around, and realize, okay, I'm not where I was.
Mhm.
God
Yeah.
is faithful. He's walked along this journey with us, and while I'm not where I want to be, I can't go back in time and undo what's been done.
Mhm.
It's changed everything about who we are. It's changed everything about our family. It's changed everything. Even my own relationship with God has changed immensely.
Mhm.
for a season there, I was wondering whether it was going to be for the better or for the worse. But
Right.
again, because of God's faithfulness, it's been for the better. And I
Mhm.
see the way that I see, there's a theology of suffering in Scripture that we as
Mhm.
Western Christians tend to just kind of gloss over. Right? It's
Right.
not it's not the fun part of being a Jesus follower that we love, that we enjoy. And even as a pastor, having preached on things related to the topic of suffering and loss and sorrow, until you've experienced it in a way that just gets at the core of who you are, it's really impossible even to see all of the depth and the insights that Scripture has for us on this topic.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one of the chapters in your book you call Your Life is Not a Hallmark Movie,
Yeah.
right? What do you mean by that? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, for the sake of full disclosure, there's a friend of mine who serves on staff at a church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and they preached a sermon series a couple of years ago, and that was the title of the sermon series, and I thought it was amazing. Uh, one of the things I've realized is that, you know, depending on how you grew up, and I was very fortunate to grow up in a family where our Christmas holidays were the same every single year. From my early childhood, the Christmas tree went in the same place. We put up the same decorations. We had the same family friends over, the same church experiences, and there was sort of a nostalgia that came with Christmas. Later on in my life, our family would travel for a ski trip with neighbor family, and so my earlier years were kind of wrapped in this romanticized Christmas at home. My later years were always the fun around our family and another family going and staying in a condo in Colorado and having these ski trips and having our little Christmas experiences. Then as a parent, I try to replicate the same things for my kids, right?
Mm.
You put up the same stockings every year over the fireplace, and you sing the same songs, and we go to the Christmas Eve service at church. And there is something, I think, inherently built into our Christmas culture in America or in the United States and Canada, where we just really try to romanticize what it is. And so, you every movie that you watch about Christmas, whether it literally is a Hallmark movie or it's, Home Alone or Die Hard. Actually, that's not, well, I don't know. Is that a Christmas movie? I don't mean to start the controversy here. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, you name it, Charlie Brown Christmas. They all end with a tidy bow tied on the story, and everybody lives happily ever after. And when you've spent your life, your marriage life, your family life, whatever it is, trying to create these family experiences, these memories for yourself, for your kids, for extended family around the holidays, when all of a sudden someone who should be there isn't there,
Mm.
it sweeps the rug right out from underneath your feet, because
Mhm.
what you've built your holidays around, if it is built around that romanticized idea of what Christmas and the holidays should be, you realize it can't be that anymore.
Mm.
And depending on how close that person that you've lost was to the center of those experiences, it can be very devastating for you. If you lose a spouse, or you lose a sibling, or you lose a child, or you lose a cousin or an aunt or uncle or somebody who was a regular part of your Christmas holidays, your Christmas celebrations, and all of a sudden that chair is empty at the table. That gift that you've always bought, that exchange that you've done with that person is no longer there. It can be gut wrenching. It can be
Mhm.
debilitating if you're unsure as to how to navigate that and how to handle that. And certainly with our family, as a nuclear family member who all of a sudden wasn't going to be there at Christmas.
Yeah.
And even though our family had been through some transition with our relocation from one city to another, and there's been some change in the way that we celebrated the holidays, there's still the aspect of, hey, we're all going to go to the Christmas Eve candlelight service at the church service together. At the church that we were a part of at the time, there was always a moment in our candlelight services where families would huddle together and pray together in that service. And I still remember that Christmas Eve service, putting that last one we had with Ephraim, putting my arm around him and just praying over him. And that was literally a month before he took his own life.
Mm.
And that was the last Christmas Eve, last Christmas we got to celebrate together
Mhm.
as a family. And, and I can't do that again. It won't be the same again. In fact,
Mhm.
needless to say, we didn't go to the Christmas Eve service the next year
Yeah.
because it wasn't going to be fun for us. It was going to
Mm.
be, weeping faces, snot bubbles, just it wasn't going to be something we could handle as a family.
Yeah. Too
And
much.
in the moment, I felt a lot of challenge and a lot of guilt for what we were doing or what we weren't doing. And of course, over the last few years, as we've navigated the holidays,
Mhm.
I've learned that there's some things that we did well, some things we did right, some things we probably did wrong. And again, when I wrote the book, I really wanted to try to help people see that you're going to probably make some mistakes. You're going to choose some things along the way that might not be as helpful as
Mhm.
others, but at the same time, there are some things that you can kind of preemptively plan for yourself that I think can help make the holidays a little less of a stress or a little less of an agonizing experience as they might be, especially if it's the first Christmas. That's one of the things that they warn you about when you lose somebody close to you. In that first year, you've got the first birthday without
Mhm.
them, the first anniversary without them, the first Thanksgiving or the first Christmas or whatever the big celebratory times of the year were for you and that loved one. And nothing prepares you for the first. You think that you might muster up the fortitude to get through it without it crushing you.
Mhm.
But it will. It does. And the one thing about Christmas is that it comes every year. Christmas comes every year, and there's not much that you can do to avoid it. And so you have to go into it, I think, with a game plan. Otherwise, it will gut you, and
Mhm.
it can really mess you up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe just because I'm the therapist here, but I noticed in your book you have like a do's and don'ts list, right? Like, and just to give people freedom, give people permission to, do what they need to do to make it through the grief during this season. One of the things you said was, don't feel guilty about being cheerful, and also
Mhm.
don't feel guilty about not being cheerful.
Yeah,
And so I think it might be easier to understand how, like, of course, you're not going to feel cheerful if you don't have that person that's going to do that tradition with you. And, you know, but also sometimes you might feel cheerful. And then some of us might feel like, well, how can I come into this feeling cheerful when I don't have that person with me? What kind of a cold-hearted person am I? Right.
yeah.
And so, let's talk a little bit about like just those emotions. Like, how do you manage those?
Yeah, well, let's start by acknowledging that you don't just
Mm.
grieve for the first year, right? So I
Yes.
just highlighted the fact that you've got the
Mhm.
first year and all those firsts, and those are hard.
Mhm.
But the second Christmas and the third Christmas and the fifth Christmas and the 15th Christmas still may have challenges for you.
Mhm.
And I think that one of the things that we have to be very careful and cautious of is not allowing ourselves to move through the valley of the shadow of death. I clung to the 23rd Psalm
Yeah.
immediately. That even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I know that the Lord is close to me.
Mhm.
And there's a blessing that comes from his nearness. The shepherd is not caught off guard by the fact that the sheep is walking through the valley of the shadow.
Mhm.
In fact, the psalm actually says that the sheep is led by the shepherd. So I asked the question, was I actually led into this season of grief and loss? Now, I'm not inferring that God caused what happened to happen, but
Mhm.
I am confident in the sovereignty of God in that it didn't catch him off guard and that
Yeah.
he's right there with me. But let's also acknowledge that this valley of the shadow is a journey, and grief is a process. It's a season. There are books written on like the stages of grief, and I've heard just as many people push back on those stages of grief as going, it's not linear. Like
Mhm.
it's two steps forward, one step back, or three steps forward and eight steps back. When you're grieving, it's up and down and all over the place, and there's no, singular way that you can monitor where you are in the process and how close you are to the end.
Right.
We know that the valley of the shadow of death, this place of grief and loss, is a journey, and it may last a long time. So, you know, I think depending on where you are in your grief journey, it's dangerous for people, especially if they've been through multiple holidays, to think, oh no, Christmas is coming up again. This is a time of year that I just absolutely have to be sorrowful and sad.
Hmm.
And because you don't have to be. In fact, the Lord doesn't want you to stay in that state. He wants you to put your hope in Him and to have eyes up and eyes forward, not on your shuffling feet as you go through the valley of shadow. And there may be, especially in that second Christmas or the third Christmas or the fourth Christmas, moments where you do feel hope and joy, and a Christmas carol makes you feel good. I'll be honest with you, we're entering a new season in our life as grandparents, which will change what
Yeah.
we do for the holidays and how we approach it. And it's a blessing for us. I'm sure there's going to be some bittersweetness in
Yeah.
that. We celebrate Christmas with these grandbabies and a new season in our lives, but at the same time, still desperately longing to have our son Ephraim back with us. And should I feel guilty for feeling joyful as God has brought us into a new season and new opportunities and a reminder of the giver of life and the giver of hope that He is? I don't think so. I don't think that's what God wants me to do. At the same time, I think it's okay to
Yeah.
not be okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to feel that loss, because that loss is real and it will be lost forever. I have an uncle who was telling me a story. He had a cousin who was killed in Vietnam. So these are older,
Yeah.
an older
Old story.
cousin. And I think my it was my uncle and my dad's cousin who had passed away, 50 years ago now. And my uncle was sitting with that guy's dad, and he had a picture sitting in his living room. And he asked him, he said, "You still miss him, don't you?" And he says, "Every day of my life." And that's the way it should be,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He lost a son at, 20 years old. And, 50 years later,
Yeah.
he's, still 40 years later, 50 years later, whatever, he's still grieving, still missing his son. That's the way it should be.
Hmm.
Grief and the grief, the pain that you feel when you lose someone is the cost of loving them to begin with, right? I, I
Hmm.
don't I don't feel hurt over someone dying that I don't love or have some
Right.
level of connection with. Um, the more you love somebody, the more it's going to hurt when you lose them. And so as you're going through the holidays, right, as you think about what you have permission to do and not have permission to, I talk about, having, or write about having permission to be joyful and
Hmm.
having permission to not be joyful.
Hmm.
Uh, Giving yourself permission to say yes to go to the holiday parties and the celebrations, and not think that people are going to judge you because you should be at home crying and weeping over your loss rather than trying to find some glimmer of holiday hope. At the same time, you should also have permission to say no. I'm
Yeah.
not going to go there. I'm not going to do that thing. I'm not going to go to that Christmas Eve service or to that company party or the neighborhood get together or whatever it is, because I just don't think it's going to be helpful for me.
Hmm.
Now, I also caution on isolating yourself, right? So
Hmm.
it's one thing to say no to everything. It's
Hmm.
another thing to find yourself stuck at home alone and trying to navigate your grief and your loss in isolation, which I think if you're listening to this podcast and you are a Jesus follower, community is one of the primary ways that I think God grows us and sanctifies us and moves us to be who He's designed us to be, which is a reflection of His Son Jesus. And so when we try to cope with our loss and our grief and our suffering alone, I think we're doing the opposite of what God would want us to do. We
Hmm.
need to be connected in community. We need to be connected to people who are going the direction that we need to go. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of the paralyzed man whose friends carry him on a mat to see Jesus. They can't get him in the house, and they tear a hole in the roof of the house and lower him down in front of Jesus. We all need friends like that in our lives. When we're
Right.
paralyzed and we can't get ourselves where we need to go, we need to be surrounded by people who will take us where we need to go and who will be willing to do whatever it takes to get us where we need to go. And ultimately, that's right back to the feet of Jesus. That's where our greatest healing and our greatest comfort is going to come from, is being with him, being in his presence. And sometimes you just have to give up on your own will and let those people carry you. If they really love you and they know you and they understand you, they'll only take you where you need to go, not somewhere else. And so,
Yeah.
the isolation during the holidays, I think, can be very devastating. I'm sure that you could speak to that as you've
Yeah.
as you've counseled and coached people, over the years.
Yeah, I think I consider my job as a Christian therapist. I see myself as one of those guys that's digging the hole in the roof,
Mhm.
like to lower down the mat.
Yeah,
Because there's a lot of people on mats that are coming into my office, and
sure.
so I have to be the one. But it does really make a difference if those are people who are in your natural part of your community, not the person you're paying, right?
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, and I have been
Yeah,
that person on the mat before too, where I
yeah.
like my faith is not strong right now, and I need somebody else just to carry me in.
Yeah, yeah. I've preached the sermon countless times. Surround yourself with people going the direction that you need to go, and you have a better chance of getting where you need to be. And
Exactly.
I think we we can often underestimate the importance of the social circles that we keep. Right?
Yeah.
We need to intentionally seek out community and people in our lives who just make us better.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I want it to be people who are headed in the same direction that I'm headed, which
Of
is
course.
trying to get closer to Jesus, right?
Yeah.
God's plan for our lives is not for us to be better versions of ourselves, but to be better reflections of Jesus. And,
Mhm.
um, when it comes to grief and sorrow and loss, Jesus was rejected. Jesus faced not necessarily grief in the same way that we do, but he certainly faced suffering,
Yeah.
and he faced rejection from people who were close to him. And sometimes the emotions of death and loss are very similar to the emotions that come with rejection.
Mm.
Rejection in a lot of ways can sometimes be like a
Loss.
death or a loss, right? So I think the emotions are very, very closely tied to each other there. But we have a Savior who's not unfamiliar with that suffering and with that hurt, and so that's something I think that we can rest in.
Yeah. Well, there's several more things I wanted to ask you about, but we're running short on time. So let me ask
Okay.
you this. How can people find your work, the book, get access to this resource?
Sure. The easiest way is just on Amazon.
Okay.
The book is called Grief Makes Christmas Complicated. My name is Bart Blair. If you search Bart Blair, you'll see a number of things that I've written. I've written some books for the church that are geared more towards church and ministry stuff. I've written some Bible studies as well. But this particular book is kind of top of the list right now. It's the most
Yeah.
recent thing that I've published. I have a website that I typically use for most of my ministry work, which is makemoredisciples.com. The
Okay.
book is also available there with all the other books and things that I've written, but those are the easiest ways to find it.
Great. So I'll have those links in the show notes so people can easily click over and find what they need. And I just want to, Bart sent me a preview copy of the book, so I was able to review it all and kind of get a feel for it. And so I want to just let you guys know, and sometimes it helps coming from a third party, not the author, that this, like he said, it's a short book. It's about 100 pages. It's not going to take you very long. It's something that you could easily share with something. One of the things I appreciate most about the book that you wrote is that after every chapter, you gave reflection questions. And this is, I'm like my ministry background is small groups, and so I
Mhm.
like I appreciate a good reflection question. So these are things that you could probably do with someone else or just use in your journal to do the reflection. And I promise you that you're going to get more out of the book if you take the time to actually do the reflection. This is where the growth happens. This is where transformation happens. So check out
Can I,
those
can I comment?
chapters.
Can I comment on that?
Of course.
I'm a reader. I read dozens of books every year. And I started adding reflection questions at the end of chapters in a lot of the books that I read, because I found that when I'm reading books that have reflection questions, I actually stop and process what I've just
You.
read. And
Okay.
if there are no discussion questions, I just move right on to the next chapter. And
Of
reflection
course.
questions, I just move right on
Yeah.
to the next chapter. And I can read a lot of books really fast that way and get to the end and go, I don't know if I actually really benefited from that.
Exactly.
So that was important for me to just say, hey, just press pause and take a
Mhm.
few minutes to think about these questions, whether you're a journaler or not. There's just an opportunity to just stop and just think through what you just read. The chapters are
Mhm.
relatively short. I
Mhm.
tried to make it as practical and helpful as possible. One of
Mhm.
the other things that I would emphasize here, especially for those that might be listening who maybe you yourself are not dealing with grief and loss this season, but you know someone who is. I've written the book from the perspective of being a follower of Jesus,
Mhm.
but I've tried to be very careful to ensure that anybody, wherever they are on their faith journey, can benefit from the tactical aspects of dealing with the holidays. Now, for full disclosure, if you read to the end,
Yeah.
you can't miss the gospel message because I really wanted to make sure that anybody who read it understood that at the end of the day, it's our anchor in Jesus that gives us the ability to find hope in the holidays. He's the reason for the holidays.
Yes.
So I don't hide the fact that the book is written from a Christian perspective, although I would say the first, 85 to 90% of the book can really be digested and helpful for anyone, regardless of where they are on their faith journey. But that last section of the book is clearly a presentation of who Jesus is and why it really matters,
Mhm.
and encouraging people to consider taking a step of faith if they really want to heal and they really want to find hope in the holidays,
Mm.
finding the real reason for our hope in the holidays. And it comes because of our relationship with Jesus, not because of our family traditions and our experiences culturally, but more of what we've anchored our faith to.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I was going to mention that too, that this book is very accessible regardless of your faith background. Obviously, Bart's not hiding the fact that he has pastoral background or that he has faith in Jesus, but those first several chapters, all the way up into the last chapter, that I really think anybody could read those. It's not, you don't have to be a believer to read those, but then you deliver the message of hope there at the end. So people can take that or leave that, right? If
Sure,
it's not
sure.
gonna
Yeah.
not fitting you at that moment, then you read that chapter and you roll your eyes. But if the Holy Spirit is speaking and tapping you and saying, in this grief, I'm here to meet you, like that could be a wonderful opportunity as well. So,
Yeah. It's amazing to me when you've been impacted with death in a way that's consequential. It just heightens your awareness. It's kind of like I say, it's sort of like, the old saying. I'm sure there's a scientific study that when you go and you buy a car, all of a sudden you see that car
yeah.
everywhere on the road. You bought a blue Hyundai, and now all of a sudden everybody drives the same blue Hyundai that you drive, right? You have this awareness. When you've been through loss like we have, all of a sudden you see it and you pay much more attention. Like 3 days ago, the mother of our neighbor across the street passed away. I got an email from a ministry colleague this morning whose father just passed away. It's like almost every single day
Yeah.
I'm getting a message from someone who has experienced some level of loss.
Yeah.
And the one thing that is true about every single one of those people is that when they hit the holidays this year, they're going to be asking themselves the questions: how am I going to get through this?
Yeah.
What can I do? How hard is this going to be? And what I'm hoping that this book will do is just give people some direction, some practical tools, and some prayer to
Mhm.
focus on that'll help them, get through the holidays. And again, find some hope even in some of their darkest times.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, let me just say too, as a person who's not going through acute grief right now, but cares about people who are, still read the book. Okay. Like it's good for us to know these things too. So Bart, before I let you go, this is your last question, same question I ask all my guests. What are you doing for soul care?
um, For me, in this particular season, it's about having people in my life who are encouragers to me.
Yeah.
We've been through an interesting season where we lost our son. We've moved to a new community. We're planting a new church,
Mm-hmm.
which always puts you in a really strange spot because we're making new relationships, forming new relationships. But I'm a firm believer that our journey as disciples is intended to be done in community and in relationship. And so for me right now, it just goes back to the same thing that I said earlier, is that I'm working to spend time around and with people whose true north is the same true north as mine. People with whom I can be vulnerable and open and honest with, who won't judge me, but who will encourage me and at the very least pray with me or pray for me. And I find that personally, outside of my own personal time with the Lord, through reading scripture and prayer, and I take lots of long walks and I listen to worship songs and I spend time praying as I take those walks. It's that relational time that really does the most to encourage me and to lift me up. It's kind of like being surrounded by mirrors, right? People who are reflecting Jesus back onto me and who are light in my life, and that's what keeps me moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I totally agree. And building that kind of network, that community in your life is really important to me also. So thanks for reiterating that and reinforcing that for our podcast listeners.
Yeah, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be on the show. And if any of your listeners would like to connect with me, I'd be happy to pray for them even through the
Mm.
Christmas holiday. So
Mhm.
they can send a message to me through my website, makemoredisciples.com. And I have a very, very long list of people that I am praying for through this holiday season, people who are going through loss and grief. And
Mhm.
I'm happy to add more names to that list. So if somebody who's
Mhm.
listening would just like me to pray for them, I'd be happy to do that.
That's beautiful. I love that. So that link is going to be in the show notes. You can contact Bart. You can share in this season. So
Yes,
thank you so much for being here, Bart, and sharing the work that you've done and just from your heart and all the things that you've experienced.
that's my pleasure. Thank you, Anne.
The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.